Imagine living in a state where nothing affects you anymore, not because you've hardened but because you've finally understood. Understood that pain is not the enemy, that peace doesn't come from control, and that suffering most of the time is born from how you react, not from what happens. Does it seem impossible? And what if it's exactly this attempt to be untouchable that's hurting you more than any person ever could? This video is not about magic formulas. It's about something rarer: awareness. An invitation to look directly at what you've always tried to avoid. To reflect on what it really means to be free from what affects you. And maybe, to discover that the problem was never the outside world, but the story your mind insisted on telling about it. 1. The desire to be unbeatable reveals a pain that was never faced. Have you ever wondered why, in certain moments, all you want is to stop feeling? That impulse to become emotionally untouchable doesn't come from nowhere. It's born from a deep pain, often so old that it's already been camouflaged by routine. The desire to be unbeatable isn't strength, it's self-protection. And all protection hides a wound that's still silently bleeding. Society sells the idea of invulnerability as a virtue. Being strong has become synonymous with never wavering, never showing, never giving in. But deep down, those who try to erase emotions all the time carry a story where feeling meant suffering too much. And now, to avoid suffering again, they prefer to numb everything, even joy. The problem is that by trying to avoid pain, you also shut the door to pleasure, connection, sensitivity. The armor meant to protect you ends up becoming an inner prison. Living trying not to feel is like holding your breath hoping fear will pass. But it doesn't, it builds up. So maybe the most honest question isn't, how do I stop feeling? But, what happened to me that made me want that? That's when a much deeper journey begins, not the search for strength, but for the truth behind your armor. 2. Being unshakable is not being insensitive. There's a big confusion between serenity and coldness. Many believe they'll only be at peace when they feel nothing, no sadness, no anger, no fear. But that's a mistake. Being at peace doesn't mean disconnecting from emotions. It means allowing yourself to feel them without being swept away. True emotional strength lies not in denial, but in permission. Being unshakable isn't not crying. It's not getting lost when the tears come. It's being able to stay present even in the midst of pain, without trying to escape, without building walls around the heart. Insensitivity may look like stability, but it's a frozen state, not a serene one. And what's frozen sooner or later breaks. When you learn to remain in discomfort, in longing, in anxiety, something begins to shift inside. Pain doesn't magically disappear, but it stops being a monster. It becomes a visitor. One that arrives, teaches something, and then leaves. The difference lies in who you become while waiting for it to go. Emotional maturity is this ability to remain whole even when everything feels fragmented. To not need to hide behind indifference to feel safe. Because the more present you are, the less the world can shake you. Not because you hardened, but because you learned to stay. 3. Absolute control is an illusion that imprisons you. There's something curious about human behavior. The more we long for security, the more we try to control the uncontrollable. We create plans, expectations, routines, strategies, all to avoid chaos. But the paradox is that, in trying to master life completely, we become slaves to the obsession with control. Nothing is more exhausting than living at war with the unpredictable. This endless search for stability has deep roots in fear. Fear of loss, of suffering, of repeating trauma. So, we try to mold the world to our will, as if that would shield us from future pain. But reality doesn't negotiate with our rigidity. And sooner or later, everything that was certain becomes uncertain, and everything that was guaranteed slips through our fingers. True peace doesn't come from control, but from trust. Not naive trust that everything will go right, but mature trust that even what goes wrong can be faced with presence. When you stop trying to force serenity, you discover it was already there, quiet, beneath all your resistance. Freedom isn't about letting go of everything at once, but gradually letting go of the idea that everything depends on you. When that happens, rigidity gives way to flexibility. And that's where a new kind of strength is born. The kind that knows how to flow with what is, instead of fighting against what should be. 4. You don't suffer from what happens, but from how you interpret it. Have you ever noticed that suffering rarely comes from the event itself, but from the story we tell about it? The human mind is a meaning-making machine. It doesn't just record what happens, it interprets, distorts, exaggerates. And from these often mistaken interpretations, wounds are born that were never caused by reality itself, but by the way we perceived it. A sideways glance, an unanswered message, a tone of voice, all of these can become a storm if interpreted through the lens of fear, rejection, or trauma. The fact itself is neutral. But our mind, conditioned by past experiences, creates narratives that inflate the event until it becomes unbearable. And the body reacts as if it were a real threat. Emotional pain, in this sense, is like a shadow that grows depending on the light that casts it. And that light, in this case, is your thoughts. When you believe them blindly, you hand over your well-being to an inner narrator who isn't always trustworthy. The mind lies, and the body suffers the consequences as if it were true. Learning to observe your thoughts without fusing with them is one of the most powerful keys to emotional freedom. It's not about silencing the mind, but about not automatically believing everything it says. Because when you realize it's not the world hurting you, but how you interpret it, power starts to return to your hands. 5. True strength is born from observed vulnerability. There's a mistaken idea that being strong means never showing weakness. But true strength isn't in repressing pain, it's in having the courage to face it without needing to hide. Vulnerability isn't weakness, it's a state of absolute presence with yourself. It's when you allow the emotion to exist without letting it take control of your awareness. Imagine the mind as a river and emotions as the currents flowing through it. Some days the waters are calm, others feel like they're about to overflow. Strength, in this context, isn't about damming the river, it's sitting by the bank and watching. It's feeling everything that comes without being swept away. Those who learn to do this develop an internal stability that nothing external can shake. The practice of internal observation, the simple act of noticing what you feel without judgment or reaction, completely changes your relationship with suffering. When you stop identifying with pain, it loses the power to consume you. You feel it but you don't drown. You acknowledge it but you don't dissolve. It's a quiet maturity built in your innermost self. In this posture of attentive presence, you discover a strength that doesn't shout, doesn't show off, doesn't need to prove anything. It's just there, firm, serene like a rock in the storm. And when you reach that point, you realize vulnerability doesn't weaken you, it grounds you. 6. You feed what you resist. There's a silent law in how the psyche works. What you reject, persists. The more force you use to resist an emotion, a thought, or a memory, the more presence it gains within you. Resistance is an invisible fuel. Fear doesn't disappear when denied, it expands in the dark. And often what we most want to get rid of is what most imprisons us. The mind creates sophisticated traps. It convinces you that acceptance is giving up, that allowing is surrendering. But it's the opposite. Acceptance isn't resignation, it's clarity. It's the act of stopping the waste of energy fighting reality and, from there, finding your center again. What is accepted transforms. What is denied repeats. Look at uncomfortable thoughts, difficult feelings like visitors. They may knock on your door, but they don't have to take over the house. If you observe them without reacting, they lose their power. If you try to force them out, they come back louder. The secret is letting them pass, like clouds in a sky that's not attached to any shape. Acceptance doesn't mean approving or liking what you feel. It simply means ending the inner war. And when that war ends, a healing silence appears. A space where things just are, and because of that, lose the power to hurt you. This is one of the greatest silent revolutions of the human soul. 7. Silence is more powerful than any internal argument. The mind speaks all the time. It questions, criticizes, compares, repeats, anticipates. It's a constant noise disguised as rationality, but often just fear in the mask of logic. And the more you try to counter those thoughts, the stronger they get. Because the mind loves debates and hates silence. But silence that does transform. There is a kind of presence that doesn't argue with the mind. It doesn't try to convince or be convinced. It simply observes. And in this quiet attentiveness, something magical happens. Thought loses its gravity. It's still there, but it's no longer law. It's as if the words lose their power to hurt because they no longer meet resistance to exist. Most people try to fight mental noise with more noise. They read motivational quotes, repeat mantras, force positivity. But all of that, when done to suppress discomfort, only feeds restlessness. True relief comes when you stop responding. When you stop trying to win against the mind, and simply choose not to join the fight. Silence in this context is not emptiness. It's contained strength. It's the space where you don't need to defend yourself or prove anything to yourself. Where the mind barks but you don't bark back. And when that happens, the peace that arises isn't a conquest, it's a return. A return to your center where nothing needs to be said for everything to be understood. 8. The external world only hurts those who are disconnected from themselves. Much of the pain we feel in human interactions doesn't come from others, but from the gap between us and our own presence. When we are disconnected from ourselves, we become vulnerable to what the world says, does, or ignores. The smallest criticism feels like aggression. The smallest gesture feels like rejection. And everything starts to hurt because no one is truly inhabiting their own body. Being present is more than being attentive. It's being whole. It's when you no longer need the world's validation to feel real. In this state, external stimuli still happen. Someone may be rude, unfair, indifferent, but you're not pulled into the emotional whirlpool. Because there is an inner anchor holding you. The mind, by its nature, wants to react. But the awakened being observes. Reactivity is a symptom of absence. The more scattered you are from yourself, the more you respond on autopilot, the more you take things personally, the more you get lost in mental scenarios that don't reflect reality. Presence, on the other hand, makes you lucid. You feel but you choose how to act. You perceive but you don't identify. And that changes everything. This lucidity doesn't come from effort but from return. Returning to yourself is the simplest and most powerful antidote to unnecessary suffering. Because when you are there, whole, nothing drags you away. The world can make noise but it doesn't throw you off balance. Because your center no longer depends on anything outside of you. 9. To be untouchable is to live beyond form. There is a point of consciousness where wounds can't reach. Not because you've become insensitive, but because you've stopped confusing yourself with the identity that suffers. Suffering is born of attachment to an image, to a narrative, to an idea of how things should be. And as long as you're trapped in these forms, you'll keep being struck. Because everything with form can be broken. The ego, that psychological construct that says, I am this, lives in constant vulnerability. It gets offended, compares, defends itself. But the being who observes the ego, that one remains untouched. When you access that silent place within yourself, you start to notice that the pains still happen, but they no longer find a fixed target to stick to. You feel them but you don't fragment. It's as if, instead of being a container where suffering accumulates, you become the space through which everything flows. The now has no fixed identity. It just is. And when you dissolve into this state of presence, the self, that carries wounds, stories, and defenses starts to lose importance. Not because it stops existing but because it no longer commands everything. To be untouchable, then, is not a state of hardness. It's a state of radical lightness. A detachment from the ego without rejecting it. A recognition that pain only hurts as long as there's someone trying to protect themselves from it. When that someone goes silent, there's nothing left to be hurt. And in that absence you find a freedom that can never be threatened. 10. Nothing can affect you. When you understand that nothing is personal. One of the most liberating discoveries of the inner journey is realizing that life has no intention. It's not testing you or punishing you. It just happens. But the mind, centered on itself, interprets everything as personal. Someone else's silence, an unexpected loss, a momentary failure. And so what was merely an event becomes an attack. And the attack becomes suffering. This illusion that everything revolves around you is what fuels the pain. It makes you close off, get defensive, hold resentment. Because when everything feels personal, everything demands defense. But what if none of it was about you? What if what the other said or did was just a reflection of their own pain, not yours? What if the world wasn't against you, but simply following its indifferent course, like the wind? When that understanding begins to dawn, something changes profoundly. You stop reacting and start observing. You stop carrying burdens that were never yours. You stop building walls to protect yourself from enemies that exist only in your interpretation of the facts. And that absence of defense brings a rare kind of peace, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances but on clarity. Nothing can truly affect you when you stop interpreting everything as an attack. When you understand that what happens outside doesn't define what happens inside. And that peace doesn't come when the world changes, but when the need to control and protect yourself fades away. That's when life flows and you flow with it, light, present, untouchable. If you've made it this far, perhaps you've realized that true strength isn't about being immune, but about being intimate with yourself. That peace isn't won out there but built within in the way you observe, interpret, and choose to respond. None of what was said requires perfection, only presence. If this content stirred something in you, share your perspective in the comments. Every honest experience nourishes the journey of someone else who's also seeking. And if you want to keep exploring topics like this, the next video is already waiting for you on the screen. Maybe it brings exactly what you didn't even know you needed to hear. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and keep following reflections that don't stay on the surface. Sometimes, a single idea is enough to change everything.